Pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm Susanna Southard from the faculty at Phillips Theological Seminary. I think this may be about the fourth time that I've been with you. It tends to be about once a year, right? And there's also been a slight change because when Dr. Biggs was here, it was usually Mother's Day that he asked me to come. So this time we'll be talking about women again, but something a little bit different from, I've always tried to tailor it to Mother's Day before, so this will be new. Dr. Tankersley said that you have made it to Genesis chapter 25. Does that sound right? What he didn't tell me is how far into chapter 25 you've gotten. So I have a plan, but I'm just curious, does anybody know what verse you're on or how far you've gotten? Okay. All right, so you've advanced beyond when he called me. Okay, well, we're going to back up a little bit. Okay, so he left an opening for those of us who are filling in. That's what happened. That was very well. Oh, okay. I see. Well, it sounds like you're having a lot of fun working your way through many books about Genesis. Okay. Well, before we start, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for the gift of this day. We thank you for the gift of the people who are gathering in this room to study your word together, to think together, to imagine together, and to listen together to whatever word you might have for us today. We offer our prayers for those who are not in this space with us, for all who are in need of your special love and care, and we offer ourselves to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Well, Genesis 25 is a chapter that covers a transition in the patriarchal or matriarchal period, right? So for the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you're doing the primordial history. Starting with chapter 12, you get Abraham. Abraham and Sarah get 13 chapters to tell their story, right? And Jacob and his family get the whole rest of the book of Genesis, which is going to be about 25 or 26 chapters. Isaac, as an adult, and Rebekah get a portion of chapter 24 and a portion of chapter 25. So they basically get one chapter to tell their whole story, which I think is interesting for a variety of reasons. But I thought it might be helpful for us to focus today on what that transition looks like. There is a sense in which the whole purpose of the Isaac and Rebekah story is to provide a link from the Abraham and Sarah story to the Jacob, Leah, and Rachel story. And if you think about the life of Isaac, pretty much from the beginning he is a link. Because his very birth is a sign of God's faithfulness to God's promise, right? Isaac's first existence in the biblical narrative is as a dream, as a promise, as one who is expected. And then he shows up. He doesn't have to do anything, he doesn't have to say anything, but he becomes a central element of the story itself, right? Carrying it forward. And there's a sense in which he continues to play that same role even when he grows up as an adult. I left out, of course, the part when he's a child and either a young child or a teenager, depending on how you read the text, when Abraham, his father, takes him to the mountain, right, to sacrifice him. Again, he's a participant in that story, but it's not really about him, right? Okay. So when we get to this middle generation of the patriarchs and matriarchs, we're not given a whole lot of information, And the information that we are given is less about Isaac, it seems, and more about Rebekah in terms of who it is who takes action, right? I thought it might be interesting to begin our time together before we actually do some reading and some conversation to get in touch with the images, the thoughts, the memories that we already have in mind about these individuals. So when I mention Isaac to you, what are some words that come to your mind, or what are some ways that you might describe Isaac? How do you think of him? Nobody thinks about Isaac. Poor guy. That's really what his life is destined for. Yeah. Should we call him a patriarch or not? Thank you. That's an excellent question, and we're going to talk some more about that. Traditionally, of course, he is. And, throughout, then later in the scriptures, there are repeated references to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he's always included in that list. Okay. I'll go ahead and show you my hand. Part of the argument that I'm going to make today is that we should consider the possibility when we see that of instead reading the God of Abraham, Rebekah, and Jacob. Okay. All right. What other thoughts? I'll tell you, when I hear Isaac, the first thing that always comes to my mind is the meaning of his name, which, as you probably know, is laughter. Sarah laughed, Abraham laughed. When he was born, he was a source of joy. Laughter. Anything else that you think of with Isaac? Yeah. Okay, so he let his sons work out the birthright and the blessing. He didn't really take an active role in that stuff. Okay. You probably can't see this because I'm writing too small. So gave up his role, his role that he should have taken as a father to manage the blessing and the birthright. He let his kids work that out themselves. Okay. Whether it was intentional or not. So I'm going to use some words like dim-witted, or that may be too strong, maybe just inattentive. And of course, by the end of his life, he's not seeing well. The reason that they're able to trick him is that his senses aren't doing very well. But there really isn't the one time in all of Isaac's story where he really shows some smarts is as a kid when he and Dad are walking up to the mountain and he's paying attention to what they're bringing along. And he says, "But Dad, where's the lamb?" Right? Where's the sheep for the offering? That's the one time he's really thinking. Okay. Now all we have to go on is the stories as they're told about him. So if we're going to assume that Isaac was a real person who lived in real time, please know that there's probably a whole lot more to him, right, than just what the scripture tells us. All right, when I use the name Rebekah, what are the images that come to your mind about Rebekah? Okay. Strong. What else? Gracious? Oh, you guys are good. She had a favored son. As did Isaac. And that led to a whole lot of problems later, didn't it? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, a worker, a doer. So she's strong-willed, and she's also strong, a body and of presence. Yeah. I'll tell you a word that is often used. You all have really read and studied, so you're in good shape. Often a word that is used of Rebekah is, she's manipulative. Or in storytelling terms, she's a trickster, which is a part of how she exercises her strong will, right? Okay. Okay. Good. There's actually a feminist scholar who refers to Rebecca as the binder because her name comes from a word that means to tie together. And so she ties the family together. She ties the generation, or the patriarchal generations together. She also, as do some other women in the Hebrew Scriptures, holds together God's plan or God's desire for, right, the future of the family. So, binder. Okay, this is good. This is very good. Let's go back to chapter 24 to see what language the text actually uses about her. And I want to begin when the servant goes on his mission. You know, he's been commissioned by Abraham to go back to where Abraham's family is from, to find a good wife for Isaac, and gives him a lot of instructions, and the servant devises a plan, and then he looks for a particular kind of woman. Let's see if we can find that. All right. It's when he begins his prayers. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? I'm just going to start reading that whole story because it's I work most easily when we just work through the story. I'm starting at the beginning of chapter 24. Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh." And I assume you talked about that with, yeah, okay. "And I will make you swear by Yahweh, the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but will go to the country and to my kindred to get a wife for my son Isaac." The servant said to him, "Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land." Do you know what's significant about that sentence from the very beginning? Notice Rebecca is going to get to make a choice, right? Whatever woman he finds is going to have the option of following him back or not. That's significant. And by the way, she'll make that choice. All right. He asks, "Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came?" In other words, what if I find the right woman and she insists on staying at home and Isaac has to go live with her, right? Well, Abraham doesn't want that because he doesn't want his son to leave the promised land. Abraham said to him, "See to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land, will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there." So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, swore to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all kinds of choice gifts from his master. And he set out and went to Aram Naharaim, there you go, to the city of Nahor, and he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water. Why did he go to a well? That was the proper place to meet a wife. Moses met a wife there, right? Okay, people meet wives there. Which, by the way, when you're reading in the New Testament and Jesus is at the well in Samaria and meets the Samaritan woman, when you think about that story in comparison to all the other well stories we have, it's quite an interesting way to read it. Just planting that seed for you. Okay, not because I'm not claiming that Jesus was looking for a wife, but what I am saying is that all of the associations that we make with those wife stories can help understand some of the aspects of the conversation between the woman and Jesus at the well. Okay. He made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water. It was toward evening time, the time when women go out to draw, and he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love. You know the word chesed, right? Steadfast love, loyalty, devotion to my master Abraham. I am standing here by the spring of water, and the daughters of the town people are coming out to draw water. Let the girl to whom I say, please offer your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown chesed, steadfast love to my master. What is the first quality that the servant is looking for in a wife for Isaac? Generosity, did I hear that? Generosity, perhaps you recognize the term hospitality. Who else do you know who famously in the Bible showed great hospitality to a stranger? Abraham. Remember when the 3 strangers came to visit and it turned out to be the angels of God? Yeah? And Abraham's great virtue was the level of hospitality that he bestowed on these guests. So the servant is asking for someone who, like Abraham, knows how to show hospitality to a stranger and his camels. Okay. Before he had finished speaking, there was Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, coming out with her water jar on her shoulder. So she presumably was just carrying out her daily tasks. Now, here's what the biblical narrator wants us to know about her. The girl was very fair to look upon. She was beautiful. All right, so the wife of Isaac had to be generous with hospitality and beautiful. She was also a virgin whom no man had known. The feminist scholars will tell you that when the word virgin is used, that's how women probably talked about the state of virginity. And the word is betulia. And that when it says whom no man had known, that's how men tended to talk about a woman's virginity. My senior professor at Vanderbilt used to point out that in the ancient world, virginity did not necessarily mean a woman who hadn't had sex. Virginity meant a woman who had not yet given birth in the Mesopotamian world in that time. So he would make the case that the reason both of those are stated here, a virgin who had not yet known a man, is to say she was both childless and what we would consider a virgin today. Okay? That's just trivia for you to know. So these are the requirements for a good wife for Isaac. And by the way, whoever said she's also a hard worker, the fact that she was there promptly to get the water at the well probably suggests that she also was good at taking care of her tasks. Okay. She went down to the spring, she filled her jar, and came back up. And the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please let me sip a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. So she didn't do it reluctantly. She quickly, eagerly gave him some water. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw for your camels also until they have finished drinking." So, first of all, she passes the test. This is the sign. Okay, God says this is the right one for you. But not only does she offer to water the camels, she promises to see the job through. Right? This is another sign of what a good worker she is. I'm going to water them until they're done. And one of the commentators that I looked at pointed out, that's going to take a long time to water 10 camels with just a pitcher of water that she's carrying back and forth to the trough. So, yeah. By the way, as long as I'm talking about my Professor Jack Sasson at Vanderbilt, I'll also mention he is quite adamant, and scholars, in fact, are having this discussion right now. The evidence suggests that camels were not yet domesticated at the time that Abraham would have lived. So the notion that the servant traveled with camels is probably anachronistic. The that the people who were telling the story later told it that way because that's how they would have traveled, but that he probably would not have had camels to travel with. That's just another piece of trivia for you. Okay. Only people who really study history know some of those details, right? Okay. Verse 20, so she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw, and she drew for all of his camels. And the man gazed at her in silence to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. Well, I thought she'd already passed the test. I guess he wanted to make sure that she really finished the job before he was convinced, right? So he just sat there and watched her. Apparently, willingness to join in the labor was not a requirement of servants in those days, or so. I don't know. I'm surprised that he didn't help her out, but it's okay. He was the guest, so she was showing hospitality. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing 1/2 shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels and said, "Tell me whose daughter you are." I actually think we've talked about this before. When you're speaking to women, you don't ask the question, "Who are you?" You say, "Who do you belong to?" Right? Whose daughter are you? Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? So it's not entirely clear when he pulls out the jewelry whether this is a gift in gratitude for her hospitality, whether this is an offer to pay for spending the night at their house, or whether this is some kind of a dowry. It might even be the first hint to Rebecca that there's a possibility of a marriage here. I think we don't know the answer to that question, but it's interesting to contemplate if you were Rebecca and you were just getting water for this stranger and his camels, and he suddenly pulled out a bunch of jewelry and handed it to you, or showed it to you. He hasn't handed it over yet, I guess. What would you make of that, right? What would that mean? And she said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." And she added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder and a place to spend the night." So that was his welcome to come home with her. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness, chesed, toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the way to the house of my master's kin." So he's very excited because not only did she meet all the qualifications, but she belongs to the right family too. Depending on how you read the text, it looks as though Rebecca's grandfather was the brother of Abraham, right? So her father was a cousin to Isaac. That's how they were connected. All right. And marriage to relatives like that was not uncommon. In fact, it was a desirable thing because then people were trustworthy, right? So you wanted to marry within the family. By the way, another thing that is of interest here, and this is just a part of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. When strangers come, you provide what they need. But he asked who she was. She never asked him who he was, right? He offers this prayer where he names Abraham, but Rebecca had never said, "And so who are you?" or "Where do you come from?" right? She just offered the place to stay. The girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now, there are some scholars, right, it's very unusual to see references to the mother's house. When we do see them, they tend to be associated with marriage plans. There are some scholars who wonder, because of this and also the fact that it's the brother Laban who does the bargaining rather than her father directly, that maybe Rebecca's father may have died, and so the mother is now responsible for the house. Probably the more likely explanation is that Bethuel had more than one wife, and each wife kind of maintained her own household, who was responsible for her children and her servants and so on. And so Rebecca was going specifically to the household that belonged to her mother in a part of a larger group of homes that were all associated with Bethuel's family. Does that make sense? But it's a very interesting thing to ponder. Okay, verse 29. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran out to the man to the spring. By the way, those of us who have read ahead know that the quality of manipulation and the role of trickster is something that Rebekah and Laban have in common. It seems to be a family trait, which they do pass on. Yeah, okay. All right, Laban ran out to the man to the spring. As soon as he had seen the nose ring, so notice the first thing he pays attention to is the wealth, and the bracelets on his sister's arm, so that tells us, yes, in fact, they had been presented to her and she had accepted them. And when he heard the words of his sister Rebekah, "Thus the man spoke to me," he went to the man, and there he was, standing by the camels at the spring. And he said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside when I have prepared the house and a place for the camels?" So Rebekah had said, "Yeah, I think there's a place for you." She ran back, but it was actually Laban who said, "Come," right? And they went together to the house. So the man came into the house, and Laban unloaded the camels, gave him straw and fodder for the camels and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, "I will not eat until I have told my errand." And he said, "Speak on." So he explained it, and I think I'm going to skip over this. So the servant then rehearses, "Here's how I came to be here. This is what I'm looking for. This is what happened. This is why I think Rebekah may be the right one." Okay. So verse 49. "Now then, if you will deal loyally and truly with my master." By the way, the word chesed is used here too. So God is showing faithfulness. This is your chance to show faithfulness. "Tell me, and if not, tell me, so that I may turn either to the right hand or to the left." So he wants to know if they're going to have a deal. Then Laban and Bethuel answered. So either both of them are present, or Laban is speaking on behalf of his father. Whether that's because his father is indisposed or not alive, we don't know the answer to that question, but it seems likely that Laban is speaking with the agency of his father and that his father's not present. Otherwise, his father would have spoken for himself. "The thing comes from the Lord. We cannot speak to you anything good or bad." So, look, if God says this is the way it's supposed to be, we're not going to argue, which is a pretty smart stance to take, don't you think? "Look, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." So Laban agrees to the marriage without asking Rebekah yet, right? But she's apparently there witnessing the whole thing. "When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the ground before the Lord, and the servant brought out jewelry of silver and gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah." So she got all the things that she was going to get to take with her into her marriage. "He also gave to her brother and to her mother costly ornaments." So here we do have dowry. "Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. And when they rose in the morning, he said, 'Send me back to my master.' Her brother and her mother said, 'Let the girl remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go.'" Now, again, those of us who have read ahead in the story, we know what happens when somebody agrees to stay for a little while, right, at Laban's house, and then suddenly they're staying there for 14 years. Right? Okay, so in this case, the servant was very wise. No. He said to them, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has made the journey successful. Let me go, that I may go to my master." And they said, "They will call the girl and ask her." We will call the girl. And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will." And I just realized the significance of something I hadn't paid attention to earlier. But it's the same distinction that we made at the beginning of the story. They made the arrangement for Rebekah and Isaac to be married. what Rebekah gets to decide is not whether or not to marry Isaac. What she gets to decide is whether he has to come live with her or she's going to go live with him. Do you see that? Okay. And remember, the servant had been told, if she refuses to come with you, then you're off the hook. Okay. So they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will. And that was the final confirmation, yes, this is the right woman because she's going to come back with you. So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, who probably was, in fact, the woman who nursed her when she was a baby and had helped raise her, but also would be the nurse who would help her raise her own children, right? So there's a sense in which this is also foretelling the future of her children. Along with Abraham's servants and his men, and they blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. So they're offering a blessing of many children. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes. So many children and lots of prosperity and success. I'm going to stop for just a minute. Often when we read the stories of the women in the Bible, I should have asked for a podium where I could set that, but okay. Often we compare the stories of the women. So there are lots of ways in which Rebekah is like Sarah. What's going to happen is she's going to go back, she and Isaac are going to get married, and 20 years later they still won't have any children. Right? So the theme of barrenness and of sort of a chosen child will recur. So there are things that Rebekah has in common with Sarah. It's also the case when they get home, she's moved right into Sarah's tent. She takes over as the matriarch of the family. So there are very clear connections between Rebekah and Sarah. What we don't often pay attention to is the parallels between the women's stories and the men's stories. So in this case, we have one very direct connection between Rebekah and Abraham. They both came from the same city, from the same family, right? Do you remember Genesis chapter 12 when God says to Abram, get up and go and leave your country and your kindred? Go to the place I'm going to show you. What has Rebekah just been invited to do? Right? Get up and go, leave your home, your kindred, and go to this place that the servant is going to show you to start a new life. Very similar. What is the blessing that God and the promise that God gives to Abram? I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to give you lots of children. You're going to have lots of success, right? What is the blessing that's just been given to Rebekah? You're going to have lots of children, and your children are going to have lots of success. You see the parallels? Okay. So there's a sense in which Rebekah is repeating Abraham's journey. All right. So, okay, we're in verse 61. Then Rebekah and her maids rose up. They mounted the camels, which probably didn't exist, and followed the man. And thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. So he had a successful journey. Now Isaac had come from Be'er Lahai Roi. Do you remember Be'er Lahai Roi? I actually think I've talked to you about this before. Not that I expect you to remember every word that I say. Okay. Be'er is the Hebrew word for well. Lahai Roi, the one who sees me. Do you remember the well of the one who sees me? This well was named by Hagar when God came to her at the well. And she named it after the God who sees me and I have lived. Right? So Isaac has been hanging out, right, by the well that his mother named. Notice Rebekah was at the well doing her chores. The servant had gone to the well to recruit a wife for him. Isaac himself was also at a well. just different wells. He was settled in the Negeb, which is in the south. And Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looking up, he saw camels coming. So if this were a Western, right, what you would be seeing is the dust of the horses arriving. So he sees this group coming, and he's looking to see if he knows who that is. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel. So she saw him out there and got down off her camel. I don't know, I just try to imagine what she might have been thinking. When she saw him, was there some reason to know that he was the one that she was going to marry? Maybe. Because of what fields he was in, or maybe somebody pointed him out to her. Or maybe she just saw somebody, maybe she just saw a stranger and got down off of her camel because that's what she would do when she saw any stranger. I don't know the answer to that question. We're about to find out. And she said to the servant, "Who is that man over there?" So she didn't know yet, but she maybe had suspicions. "Who is that man over there walking in the field to meet us?" So you also then have to ask the question, was he beautiful too, right? Was she attracted to this person that she saw across the field? I don't know. The servant said, "It is my master." So she figured out, okay, this is the person I'm going to be marrying, and she went and put on a veil. We don't know for sure what the veil means, but probably it is a part of the wedding ceremony, right? So if she's going to see her husband for the first time, she wants to be wearing the wedding veil in order to do things properly. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done, and Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. So that is a connection I mentioned earlier. And they consummated the marriage right there. He took Rebekah, she became his wife, and he loved her, which is fortunate because there was no guarantee that that would be the case. So it's really a good sign that he loved her. Probably also a good sign that he was going to be capable of loving the children, or at least one of the children. But notice what the text does not tell us. Did Rebekah love him back? We can assume so, but right? It doesn't. It's not concerned with how she felt, I guess. But Isaac loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So now he has a wife to take the place in his heart of where his mother had been. Okay. By the way, there are many stories in the Hebrew Bible where men who are grieving find their comfort by taking a new wife. So whatever that means. All right, now we're finally up to chapter 25, which is where I think we were supposed to be. And we're going to skip over Keturah. Dr. Tankersley talked to you about Keturah, right? The wife that Abraham took in his old age. Okay. Because he told me some of the things he was reading, so I assumed that he was going to talk to you about that. All right, and then Abraham died and was buried with his wife Sarah. And I think you probably are already aware that the grave where Sarah was first buried and then Abraham was buried with her was the first piece of property that Abraham owned in the Promised Land. It was a very significant purchase. All right. Then we hear about some descendants. We're skipping that part. Again, because I assumed that y'all would be reading all of these verses and I was going to do something kind of on top of it. But that's all right. We're good. I want to skip to... I want to skip to verse 19. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham was the father of Isaac. That's a little redundant, but there you go. And Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. This actually reminds me of two separate stories. One is the story of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, which is another case of a barren woman. who is very loved by her husband. And in the case of Hannah, this is all in the opening chapters of 1 Samuel. In Hannah's case, she's the one who prays for a child. But before that point in the story, her husband tries everything that's within his power. He gives her twice as much of everything. He tries to say, am I not worth more to you than your children, than 7 sons would be? He tries to make her happy, and he just can't do it because she really wants to have children. So I imagine we've just been told that Isaac loves Rebekah. When Isaac prays for Rebekah, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking it's because he's trying so hard to make her happy. The text doesn't say that, but when I read the story, that's how I read it, okay? That he really, really wants her to be happy because he loves her. Okay. This also reminds me of a New Testament story, which is Zechariah and Elizabeth, where Zechariah prays for Elizabeth to have a child. Okay. So there are all kinds of connections among the biblical stories. All right. So Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. Now I do have to ask the question. We're going to learn, when you add up all the numbers, what you discover is the two of them were married for 20 years before she had a baby. So had he been praying for 20 years and God finally chose to act, or did he wait for 20 years and finally decide to pray? Again, we don't know. The text doesn't tell us, but it sure seems like an interesting question, why the barrenness continued for 20 years. The children struggled together within her. Now, I confess I've never been pregnant, but I know many women have been. I'm guessing some people in this room have been. And when the child becomes active, you feel that, right? Anybody here who's had twins or triplets? I'm just guessing that the more children that you're carrying, probably the more active it is. And that there are times when it's a joyful thing to feel a life moving within inside you, and there are other times when it might be quite painful. That's my guess. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Rebekah was experiencing a lot of distress, to the point where she asks this question: if it is to be this way, why do I live? I can't take this anymore. Nobody knows exactly what she means by this. Different translations handle it differently, but it's pretty clear that she's in severe distress, and she's trying to understand it because God has given these children as a response to prayer. So she went to inquire of the Lord. When you see those words, inquire of the Lord, in the Bible, that doesn't just mean an ordinary prayer. This is the language that's used when you are seeking prophecy. So, for instance, the Urim and the Thummim, which the priest had in his breast pocket in Exodus, and later somehow King David ends up with them, which is weird, but it's supposed to be a priest. They're sort of like dice that you ask a yes or no question and you roll them, and then the way that they turn out tells you what the answer is, yes or no. When people would go to the priest and seek the guidance from God using the Urim and the Thummim, the language that's used was that they inquired of the Lord. Whenever the nation of Israel was getting ready to go into battle, they would first inquire of the Lord. Is today the right day to go fight our enemies? Will you give us victory if we fight today? If the answer was no, they would wait until the next day. They would wait until it came up yes. This was a way of seeking God's will. So we don't know for sure whether Rebekah just went to a prophet. Deborah, for instance, later in the story, would sit under her palm tree and people would come and inquire of the Lord with her, right? Would seek her wisdom. So we don't know whether Rebekah went to a prophet or whether she went to a priest. This is all before the Exodus, so we don't even know. But that language is very technical language that means she was seeking some kind of professional word from God. All right. And however she did it, the Lord's response was this. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. So basically the answer was, yes, you're right, something bad is happening inside of you, and it's going to keep happening forever. That's not very encouraging, is it? When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. So I guess without ultrasound or anything, she may have suspected that she was going to have more than one baby. The oracle told her she was going to have more than one baby, but the way she finally knew for sure is when she gave birth and had 2 children. The first came out red. That's significant because Esau's other name is going to be Edom, which means red, and it relates to the red porridge that he ate. Right, okay. First one was red. His body was like a hairy mantle, and the word Esau is related to the word for hair. So they named him Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob, which means like heel grabber. And Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. That's how we knew that they were barren for 20 years. He was 40 when they married, 60 when the child was born. And then the boys grew up. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was a quiet man living in the tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And that's the story that we referred to earlier, and you've already jumped ahead to read. Okay. So, when the boys are older, because of the favoritism, the way in which Rebekah loves Jacob, she takes matters into her own hands to be sure that he gets the blessing that is being passed on from Abraham. Here's the question. We have this oracle from the Lord that comes before the children are even born. Is this an expression of God's will, God's plan for how this is supposed to happen, saying Jacob is the one who's going to come out on top, the one who's born second is going to come out on top? In which case, when Rebekah takes actions to make sure that happens, what she's doing is acting as an agent of God, right? To make sure that things come out the way God said they were supposed to come out. Or is it a case where God just knows what's going to happen and says it, right? And doesn't seem to object to it, and so even though Rebekah is the one who makes it happen, she has God's stamp of approval on it from the oracle. Right? I don't know how you want to read that, but either way, when Rebekah takes the steps that she takes to make sure that Jacob is the one who in fact gets the blessing, what's clear is that God is endorsing whatever's happening, not making any efforts to prevent it, right? So it's either what God wanted in the first place or it's something God's willing to work with, right? Okay. And this seems to be the case actually for several women in the early history of Israel, that they are the ones who make sure that things go the way in which God had wanted them to go, right? When the men, for some reason, do not seem to be following through. Okay, so then the question becomes: any questions or comments about how we just read the story? I think we should go back to this question then. Is Isaac a patriarch? Should we call him a patriarch or not? And maybe before we answer that question, we need to identify what do we mean by the word patriarch. Who are we identifying when we say the patriarchs of ancient Israel? If we're taking that word just at a really literal level, so we mean like the main fathers, then I think we have to say, yes, Isaac is a patriarch because this is how the genealogy goes, right? Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. and on to, we get Joseph's story, but Judah is really the one who becomes, right, the nation that becomes primary for Israel. But if by patriarch what we mean is the leaders the people who really truly defined the family that becomes Israel, right? The people through whom God provided the leadership, so that when we're constantly referring to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as a way of naming who God is and identifying who the people are, then I think a case could be made that Isaac didn't really play much of a role. And so either we say there were two, Abraham and Jacob, or we say Abraham, Rebekah, and Jacob were the leaders who really shaped that early history of Israel. Now, I'm just offering that to you. We're not going to, there's no reason to go back and try to change what all the Psalms say and everything. We'll read it the way that it says. But isn't it interesting to think about this? Now, does that get at your question? Okay. How much time do we have? Do we need to stop, or do we have a few more minutes? It's 9:30 or 10:35. Do we go to 10:40? We have 5 minutes? Okay. I'm going to assume that you've heard this before, so it won't just scare everybody. But I was thinking about it on the way here. When scholars talk about the history of how the nation of Israel came to be, there are sort of three main ways that people tend to think about it. You know that in terms of corroborating evidence, like the archaeology that we have, we don't have any evidence outside the Bible that goes clear back to the time of Abraham. You know that, right? We don't even really have much evidence that goes back to the time of Exodus. We have a disputed... Our first piece of evidence comes from about the 12th century. And depending on how you read it, it either tells us that Israel was just now becoming known in Palestine as a group of people, or it's telling us that Israel was an established nation. And there are some scholars who read it one way and some who read it the other. I'm referring to the Merneptah Stela, for those of you who know the history. But we don't have any direct evidence that describes the period of slavery in Egypt the way that the Bible describes it. So we don't have that corroborating evidence. So there are some scholars who choose to see the Bible as a historical document, to say that we should assume that however the Bible tells the story is an accurate historical representation unless or until we find information that disputes it. And then we stop and talk about it. Okay? That's one approach. There's a second approach that says and I will confess to you that I tend to take this perspective, which is to say, I believe when these ancient stories were written down, what people were trying to tell us was not historical detail, but a theological understanding of why things became the way they became. I don't think the purpose was ever to give us like a newspaper that says, here's what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened. It was people trying to explain, this is who we are and why we are who we are in relation to God. Okay, so the second prominent theory is that it was really the Exodus that shaped the identity of what became the nation of Israel. And that all the stuff that happened before Exodus, those were old stories that were passed around and just got preserved, but are not necessarily historically reliable. But once we get to the Exodus, from that point on, we're good. Yeah. And and then there is a third, a more controversial approach, and again, I'll just tell you where I stand so you know. I'm somewhere between the second one and the third one. Okay? The third one says it's entirely possible that there was no single nation or single group of people that became Israel. That in the 12th century, in the hill country where the villages started popping up, that there were people who maybe were even moving out from the cities to escape paying taxes or other things, who gathered, and the thing that they had in common is that they all worshipped the same God. They all worshipped Yahweh. And they chose to band together and form a new people. And the way that they formed themselves as a new people is that they took their ancestral stories, and every family brought its own ancestral stories, just like all of us have our stories that we tell about our families. They collected all of those stories and they wove them together into a single narrative to say, this is going to be our story as a whole people. So by that way of thinking about how Israel came to be, you had some people who had Abraham as an ancestor. You had some people who had Isaac as an ancestor. You had some people who had Jacob as an ancestor. And you had some people who had Moses as an ancestor. And all of them brought their stories and they wrote them together as if they belonged to the same family. If we take that way of thinking about how Israel came to be, then what this tells us is there were a lot of Abraham people and they really knew their stories very well. And there were a lot of Jacob people and they knew their stories very well. And there were a lot of Moses people and they knew their stories very well. But there weren't very many Isaac people, or they didn't know their stories very well. So they just got this little bitty piece, right, in the story. So that would be one way of explaining why we have a patriarch who doesn't seem to act like much of a patriarch in the midst of it. Now, that's the most controversial of the approaches, right? So I'm just throwing that out there again. I come someplace in between. I do think that these stories were told primarily for the purpose of helping a people understand themselves as a shared identity, and that we need to be very cautious about assuming the historical accuracy of the details of these very ancient stories, because I don't think that's why they were written. I don't think that was their point. But, yeah, I think there were probably some people who lived in Egypt who escaped, right? And I do think there are ways in which God had been working from the beginning to bring people together. All right. Any comments anyone wants to make in response to that? Okay, just a little controversial thing to throw out there at the end. Yeah, my hope is that today we've explored some familiar stories and some familiar people, and that maybe you have developed an even greater understanding and appreciation for Rebecca and her role in the midst of this. And it's a reminder also that whenever we read these stories and when we think about our own stories as people of faith trying to live in this world, and that's, after all, what was happening for all of our ancestors as well, right? People of faith trying to figure out how do we live in this world as worshipers and followers of God. That this is a reminder